All right, so I will go ahead and get started. So my name is Liese Zahabi. I am assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire, and taking a cue from some of my amazing colleagues working in this space, I am a light-skinned white woman. I have long brown hair. I'm wearing black glasses, and I have a black and white striped shirt and a green sweater on today. And so I'm so pleased to be helping to moderate this panel on inclusivity and accessibility in the design classroom. And so I'm just going to ask each one of my amazing panelists to go around and introduce themselves as well. Just, mention whatever you'd like to share with us, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our questions for today. So I'm actually going to hand it off to Mina. Why don't you go ahead and go next?
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. My name is Mina Khalil. I am a designer and illustrator. I am an assistant professor of art and design at the University of South Carolina at the School of Visual Art and Design, where I teach typography, systems, interaction, and design foundations as well to majors and non-majors alike. I also serve nationally as co-chair of the AIGA Design Educators Community Steering Committee. I am a second generation Iranian American. I am sort of light brown skinned. I have dark hair and a gray streak in the front for my age. I am wearing white glasses and a black shirt with white pattern.
And why don't we go ahead and have Gabby Shawson introduce themselves next.
Thanks, Lisa. I am Gabi Shawson. I am a white male with pretty much a shaved head and a red beard, black glasses. I'm sitting in my office here at York University, which stands on the area known as Tikarono, which has been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, and I acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And I started at York a year ago as an assistant professor in the design program. I teach primarily design studies, but also design practice. I recently finished up a PhD at UC San Diego in art history, theory, and criticism, and the focus was on the design of graphic pain scales. So when you go to the doctor and they say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? And you see little smiley faces. That's what I obsessed over for a number of years, and I can get more into that during the panel. Yeah, I'm super excited to be meeting brand new colleagues because my background is not in sort of a traditional design trajectory. And so it's always exciting to be speaking with others in the field.
Wonderful. And why don't we go ahead? I'm going to swoop down and we'll have Dave go next, and then we'll end with our other Gabi.
Thanks. Dave Pablon, he, him, his pronouns. Brown male, usually darker brown during the summer, with short black hair. One of the only panelists today without glasses. I'm wearing a weird pattern shirt with comprised of yellow dots, seafoam green, navy blue, and black, and some kind of other pattern camo. I'm an assistant professor of graphic design at Columbia College Chicago. I also serve on the presidential team for AIGA Chicago, and I'm associated as a core organizer with Designers Protest and Dark Matter University. I'm happy to be here. And my field of instruction mostly is in long form publication design, but also exhibition space and the design environment. Thank you for having me.
All right, and last but not least, Gaby Hernandez, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Good friends, new friends. Yeah. Yeah, my name is Gaby Hernandez, short for a very much longer name. I'm from Costa Rica, in Central America. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I like to always make sure that people know that bilingualism and Spanish is a huge part of my personality as well, and my personhood. So that is important. I am a woman of color, brown. I guess I have currently like auburn highlights. I'm wearing my hair braided on the side. And yeah, I'm 39. I teach at the University of Florida currently, and I'm transitioning to the University of Arkansas this fall of 2021. And yeah, I identify, as I said before, as a Central American more than Latin American, because it's a great generalization of all the many countries that, you know, are part of Latin America, specifically from Costa Rica, which is a very different country to other countries in Central America that have a much greater indigenous population. We don't have a very significant indigenous population, so our genes, we could say, were more mestizos than anything else. So Costa Rican for sure. I've been living in the United States for, I want to say, 14 years. I first came as a graduate student, and I am currently an assistant professor of graphic design. And my research focus includes how our unique identities, our personal identities could be seen as a manifestation of specific cosmovisions visually, and how that could eventually become ways to rethink canons of knowledge in traditional design canons, and as starting points for important discussions about identity and design and how much design influences that. So, and I'm also very much focused on community-based design as well. So trying to, you know, bring the attention of our practice into our own communities. So yeah, that's my work, that's me.
Fabulous. And I love, we all have, I think, a lot of different kinds of perspectives that we're going to bring to the table today, which I think is really going to be very useful for our discussion. So thanks everyone for doing that. It's so great to meet everyone. So what I'd actually like to start with is just a quick conversation regarding the kinds of students that we have maybe worked with in the past. We're all educators in some context. So I would just love to hear about the different contexts that you all have been teaching in. I think that that often helps to inform the kinds of ways that we approach our students in the classroom and the ways that we think about inclusivity and accessibility and a lot of these other topics. So really quickly, I'll just mention that I adjuncted briefly out of graduate school. And so I, at one time, was working with students at a community college in North Carolina, as well as an all girls, all women, very small liberal arts college. And so those were very different and interesting contexts and situations to kind of work with students within. I've also worked at a primarily teaching university, where the focus was really looking at teaching versus research. And then I've been at 2 research-focused universities since then. And so I've worked with a pretty diverse pool of students, especially compared to the students I get to work with here at New Hampshire, very much a university context and very much in the New England context, which is quite homogenous, very sort of mostly white. So there are a lot of issues that we deal with, especially students of color and faculty of color on my campus, I think have a very different experience than in other parts of the country and the world. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I've had, I've been teaching now for almost 12 years, and I've been blessed to be able to work within all of those different situations. But I'd love to hear from my other panelists. What kinds of students have you had the chance to work with in the past? And you can define that however you'd like to talk about your students. I think totally fits.
I will gladly start once again. I began my career as a tenure track assistant professor at Virginia State University, which is a historically Black university in Petersburg, Virginia. amazing experience there. I spent an incredible first 4 years of my career cutting my teeth, really, as you would say, in design education. There before moving to Nashville, Tennessee to take a tenure track position at Middle Tennessee State University, which is in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and is a teaching university. It's a teaching focused university. I spent just a brief stint of time there before making a move to a research-focused university, and spent 3 years tenure track at University of Louisville before moving to University of South Carolina, which is a flagship state research institution. So all of these 4 universities, very, very different from one another in many ways, serving very different student populations. My very first teaching job ever was at adjunct when I was in grad school at VCU School of the Arts. So that's a school of the arts, which is also very different, right? So all of these are not just in different areas of the American South, but also serving different populations within their areas of the American South. So I could stop there actually and let someone else go. I'm going to call on Gabby Shawson.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always been drawn to public universities, and it is great. I'm pretty sure everyone here is working at public universities, and so I really do love that about this panel, which is not to say that people not working at public universities are, but it's just, there are different, I think, well, I wouldn't really know. I went to a private university for undergraduate, private college, but have since only been at public universities. And the first one was my grad school, which was Mass College of Art and Design, which is the last remaining dedicated art and design public program in school in the country, in the United States. Although even the word public is a bit of a misnomer, given that, something like 80% of funding comes from private sources and donors, right? It's whittled down. Canada is a different story. Here, a lot of people say, "Oh, is York public?" And it's actually the default here is public. There are very few private colleges and universities here, and so that was part of the draw. That said, again, what does it mean to have, I think, public universities? To me, it means something about bringing in, making the university more accessible through, public subsidies for tuition. But then the questions of what purpose does the student serve at a research institution? Mass Art is obviously not a research institution, it's a teaching college. UC San Diego was, the chancellor described it as a $1.2 trillion incubator, effectively negating, the tens of thousands of undergraduates there doing all the work and paying all the money. York is I think somewhere in between, right? I mean, we've got a lot of it's a huge university in the tens of 60,000, something like that, people across undergrad and graduate. But again, I'm sort of reminded very often that the undergraduates are sort of there to allow the university to exist, to then produce research. And so I realized the question here was about what kind of students are we teaching, and I'm a teaching stream instructor here, which is brand new at York, which was sort of a way to mitigate the reliance on contract faculty, for better or for worse. But it does provide me with an opportunity to spend a lot of time with students, and then do research on the teaching, which is also why panels like this are so exciting. So all of that said, it is a relatively diverse student body, but the design program at York actually has higher fees than the standard because of, we have something called deregulated fees, which means that students pay a little bit more, and relative to the United States, the numbers are still pretty shockingly low, but that's for equipment and access to services. But I'm really, glad to have a lot of diverse student body, a very heavy Filipino community. York is known as a very heavy Islamic communities here, and so that's really exciting to be part of. I'd say that there's not enough access to indigenous communities in Canada in general to research universities. And so that's something that I think there's a struggle with. My focus is on disability, and so disabled students. And one of my own projects is right now doing research at York on how to create a design academy that is more accessible to disabled designers. So these are things I've been trying to think about. But, you know, again, I'd sort of say, like, generally speaking, I've always been working with students at public universities, but I've learned how different that label kind of manifests along. So I'll pass it on to Gabi Hernandez.
Yeah, as a Costa Rican, I had the chance to study at the University of Costa Rica, which is the biggest, probably the main university in the country. And, you know, as it was mentioned before already, in Costa Rica, the government actually funds, I think it's 4 or 5 public universities that, you know, offer all kinds of degrees. And so I was an undergraduate there and graduated with a degree in social communication and advertising. So, and I worked in advertising agencies for maybe 4 years, hated it, and then decided to, you know, just focus on the graphic aspect of communication, and that's how I ended up in graduate school here at the United States, at the University of Florida, actually, too. Yeah, when I finished my MFA program, I did a little bit of freelancing and then started working as a professor at the University of Houston downtown. And I was there for 4 years. Before then, I was an instructor of record as a graduate student as well. So maybe 3 years. And yeah, the University of Houston downtown, I think it's probably one of those pivotal moments in life, at least for me, was because I came to the University of Houston with a lot of, you know, with the culture of the University of Florida that was very much, even though it is a public university, you know, it has an admission, series of admission requirements that are very, they are not very, how can I say this, open to, you know, everybody to be able to apply to the system. You know, it required something like a 4.4 GPA, and, you know, everything and all the resources that you know, means for a student to reach that. So, and then at the University of Houston downtown, which is a Hispanic serving institution, I was working with mostly local or regional students. And these are students who are, you know, what we call non-traditional students, which, you know, is usually the students who work or, you know, have to have families to take care of, or, you know, elderly family members. Many immigrant communities there as well. Yeah, non-traditional, totally an eye roll. And, you know, many students coming from marginalized communities. So it was a lot of everything, you know, the things that many of our students in flagship universities may not be really thinking about a lot, right? So that was a huge eye-opener for me, because I'm sure that many people who immigrate to the United States might think very differently from, you know, about the country. And when you realize the enormous differences, social, cultural, economic differences that, you know, even university students have, it's really shocking. So that was a really important time for my professional career as a professor. I was there for years. I was able to develop some initiatives that would allow my students to have access to professional practice without having to sacrifice, you know, income, or, you know, having to do a traditional internship, you know, that they usually do before graduation and stuff like that. So it was a completely different perspective, different view of how to really craft education in a way that is, you know, conscious of everybody's context in life, really. And then in 2017, mostly wanting to dedicate more time to research because the University of Houston downtown is mostly a teaching university. That's how I ended up at the University of Florida, where you know, I came back to seeing traditional students, you know, of fresh off high school, in a sort of like a residential program where they will have the same desk throughout 2 years. And so it is a very kind of focused and a very privileged space to be, really, for not only for the students, but also for us as faculty, you know, having access to students all the time during the semesters. So yeah, now I'm transitioning to another place that I don't really know much about, not as much as I know about the Houston and the Florida universities I've been. But I'm really looking forward to have a mix of everything. You know, I think that if I could put both groups together from Houston and Florida, I think that the dynamics would have been really interesting and rich. So yeah, that's my experience with the students mostly.
Just to clarify, Gabby Shawson, Columbia College Chicago is a private institution, but I think that's one of the reasons why it drew me there. I'm just gonna quickly try to like connect dots here in regards to like the student body, my experience, and who I serve. I ended up in academia a little bit by happenstance. I think I always kind of, I'll openly state that my career has been lucky breaks. And I think being able to go to art school was because I was the youngest in the family of immigrants and my parents were tired of chasing me around and justifying what I did. I ended up in an MFA program because I saw an opportunity to move back home to Chicago. And all along the way, whether it was Oakland, Berkeley, Chicago, San Francisco, I've always found myself in an urban environment. And a lot of ways, whether it was within the course load that I was assigned to, or me reaching out and working or teaching at a space that didn't look like academia, I always wanted to find myself surrounded with students that I could relate to. And so whenever it was I spent 1 year in the South in an exchange program, and it was a state university, but it was an art and design program that had a portfolio involved. I didn't feel like I could see myself, and I hated that feeling. And so wherever I go, whether it's my previous institution, which was Dominican University, another Hispanic serving institution, I wanted to see students and relate to students in ways that I could kind of talk about, and then hopefully use life experiences to see and reflect off of them so they could see themselves in the future. That's always been kind of just lucky. I don't think everybody has the choice to handpick where they go. So moving from one institution to another that was in the same urban environment of Chicago, I was very lucky to be a part of. And I take those moments of luck or catching a break, and I try to filter them and put it into places and put that energy of a place of privilege, even though I'm a person of color, and a lot of my research kind of talks about how BIPOC communities can lend design solidarity through labor, through service, and through practice.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, everyone, for that. It's always so interesting to me to have these conversations, right? Because I think so often we sort of think about students as maybe a more homogenous group, right? The faces that we see every day in the classroom, but all of our experiences are so shaped by where we are and who we're with. And so I think it's always really great to kind of hear from other educators about that. So the next thing that I want to ask, this is sort of like the big question. And so again, answer this however feels appropriate to you, but why should we care about this? Why should we care about inclusivity and accessibility when we're just in general, but also when we're teaching? So whoever would like to take that first, please go ahead. And if you need a second to think about it, please take that.
While y'all are thinking about it, I'm going to ask the question, at what point have we felt like the other in a group or in a space? And how has that influenced how we have walked through the rest of our life? And for me, I think, so Iranian American, youngest. So I think that's how I got to go to art school. Thank you, Dave. Like, my parents were done fighting. Also, I think going through the late 80s, early 90s, Desert Storm, going through the way that I grew up in Virginia. So living in a country in the US that perceived the Middle East in a certain way. So, you know, we're probably talking a little psychologically here, but we're also talking about color of skin and names. And so there's those levels of being the other. I think that to answer your question, Liese, that inherent, right, to the framework of design, we probably agree that we all understand in order for a solution to be successful, we need to consider all of the possibilities of the way that that solution gets fleshed out or used. So if we're considering all of those possibilities, then there are going to be so many of them. And theoretically, we need to look past our own personal needs in order to consider all of those outcomes. I think as a child, I started doing that really early because whether or not people perceived me as another, I felt like an other. And I stopped looking for places where I could work, like Dave had mentioned, and Dave, please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm summarizing this, please, looking for places where you could see yourself, maybe whether you could see yourself being there and thriving there, or you could see yourself reflected in the people there. I think there are lots of ways that we can understand that phrase. But I just stopped looking for that and started looking for people that were similar to me past what they looked like or past their ability, right? And I think we do this. I think we do this as humans too. So in practice, that started to look like reconsidering frame sizes of doors and handles on the doors, right? So that we can reimagine how anybody might be able to use something so intrinsic to a university to experience their classroom, right? Or it might also, for me in my syllabus, it looks like including laptop rental information, right? Where people just don't even have to ask. I put it in there, right? So reconsidering attendance policies too, I think, is another one, because as a parent and a caregiver and somebody with elderly parents, sorry, mom and dad, but you are, I think we have to be aware that people come into our space with a whole host of things that can follow them and that will follow them and that weigh on them when they're in our space. And we're the leaders of that space. So we can seek to share the lead with the people that we work with and the people that we serve. But I think that we are considered and seen as the leaders in that space. so reimagining how people who do invisible work, like caretakers and parents and things like that, might be able to show up to their university experience. I think those are the benefits. Those are the benefits because they help us as designers and people working in the framework of design to expand also how we're seeing what we do on a daily basis as designers, but also as educators and people coming into that space.
That was really beautiful, Mina. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that to your question, Lisa, why is this important? I think that for me, it's a matter of example to a degree, right? Because even though I was born and grew up in Costa Rica, and even though that Costa Rica is still a very mixed country, even if, you know, the majority of people don't really think about that too much because we're a big mix of everything. I didn't really felt like the other at any time in Costa Rica. I'm sure that the indigenous communities, the Caribbean, African Caribbean population in Costa Rica in the Atlantic side feel that way and have felt that way for a long time. We have our own issues with exclusion, of course, but looking like the majority was something that allowed me to never really see, at least in terms of color of skin, you know, that I was the other. Here in the United States, I had a pretty good experience, mostly during my MFA program. I started to feel like the other actually when I started working at the University of Houston, when one of my students started to mock my accent. So yeah, so you know, and I would have thought that such a mixed group of students would actually have a little more, I don't know, that they wouldn't you know, pay much attention to those things, but they do, you know, and that was definitely a turning point for me when I started to realize that, you know, you know, my work needed a little bit of rethinking, and that's when I started to change my path towards identity and, you know, those other related topics that really have been very important for me as a person, but also as a professor, right? And educating myself about history in the United States and, you know, what it means to be excluded in the United States, and all of those things that I try to know about and be an ally of, you know, many other situations in this country that historically have been oppressive. But I think that it's important to know that if we want to change the history, the way we do design, the way we understand design, if we want it to be a real positive experience or profession or you know, career for everybody, we really need to make sure that design can really communicate and integrate otherness into those canons, right? And I think that inclusion and accessibility and equity and many other you know, terms that we usually throw out there, but you know, if we really take actual steps to implement those, you know, as Mina said before, from the syllabus, right, and upwards, I think that the results are much positive that we can ever imagine. And related to that, there is the topic of vulnerability that I see in the list that Lisa gave us for questions, but I guess I'll wait for that for a moment. Yeah.
I think this panel is a good representation of, if there wasn't a precedent or a need for that, we wouldn't be in the seats that we're in, right? Like, would we be here if there was no need for that? And I think, just like academia is slow moving, design education is slow moving. If we think about higher ed, and it was just a couple of decades ago that ethnic studies was a validated major, was a validated field of study. And so I think it's taken some time for graphic design to get to that point, to see that there is a pluriverse when it comes to practice and canons. And so I think I would say, and I don't know, I can only speak for myself, but I think it is the role of newer professors, younger academics, to kind of instill that reflection of diversity that happens within the practice in the world, in the workforce. I think that's probably why this stuff matters. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. I don't think, I never thought I was going to be an academic. I was always doing teaching on the side as a way of activism, and I did activism on top of teaching. And I never crossed over those three things until I was just opportunistic and lucky. And again, I think that's where we have to understand our privilege and opportunity, and take up space and speak for the others out there.
And I think the flip side to what Dave really put so well is that not only do we need to represent, what the sort of workforce and what the sort of, post looks like, I think that we need to make sure that there's a path through this gate, right? Like, design is so gatekeeping, and credentials are so heavily weighted. And I came to this sort of project about making the Design Academy more accessible for disabled designers and disabled students, because I, looking at the problem of, Mina, you mentioned like door handles, right? Like, ramps. I mean, these are very industrial designy sort of things, but kind of big D design thinks about these things, and looking at them and saying, well, why are we so focused on the center of the bell curve, right? Well, obviously it's because we need to mass produce and we need to sell and blah, 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 right? So there's, not wearing my "it was capitalism all along" t-shirt, but that's obviously a very heavy weight here. But, the other part of it is that we don't have people who are disabled designing these things. And so why? Well, because they don't have access to work in the studio, because they don't have the credentials. Why? And so I'm hypothesizing that it's because our academies are not accessible to disabled designers, right? And so that's where I kind of want to open up like that continuum to different kinds of people. That's how I come to it. And I obviously come to it with an unbelievable amount of privilege. And so the goal is like to sort of block and tackle. But I think Dave also pointed out that you need to have new faculty and younger faculty initiating it now, because the older faculty are it's just not on the radar, whether they, and it's not necessarily a nefarious, like a sort of property or quality of the older faculty. It's just not on the radar until you bring it up. And then I do have a lot of colleagues who are like, oh yeah, that's a great point. And I let's see what happens. I'm excited.
Gabby had sort of mentioned this idea of vulnerability, which I put on the Google Doc that we had all shared. And I think that for me is a really big part of how I try to just be right with my students. I've had colleagues who it is really difficult for them to be vulnerable with their students. And then in that way, I think it's really difficult for their students to be vulnerable with them. So, one of the questions I had was just, what are your thoughts about that personally for you, of being vulnerable in the space of the design classroom, or just a mentorship kind of relationship, and how might you make space for your students in that way? Or, if you feel more like my colleague, right, that's just not necessarily appropriate, just kind of what your thoughts about vulnerability are in general. And whoever would like to start, please go ahead.
I can take this one. Yeah, I mean, I think that if we want to be an inclusive space, that means, I mean, design education, right? If that is an inclusive space, we need to really go to the root of everything and start thinking about, why, first of all, we're working on this, right? And what are the causes? So decoloniality is one of those things that, have become to some degree a buzzword, because it's obviously much more complex than people usually think about. But I think that it is really important to know that one of those things that, have been a huge part of academia, and, that have contributed to lack of access and inclusion, is those hierarchies of knowledge, right? The idea of, there is a professor, there is a mentor, there is, all these like vertical systems that, at the end, it really creates this disconnection between, the students, especially those who are underrepresented, and, the people who hold and produce the knowledge. So I think that vulnerability in that kind of work is important, because it really brings us all to the same level, right? It levels us. It puts us in a horizontal system, so that, we can all see ourselves as, equally important. All of us, all our experiences are equally important. And that requires a whole lot of vulnerability, not only in the sense of, knowing that you are giving up that kind of hierarchy, but also it's a process that requires, patience, humility. It requires a lot of, self-reflection and work for us to know how to craft the story so that it has some sort of purpose in the classroom. So yeah, I think that, it directly relates to inclusion and access, because the students really need to see themselves represented. Even though, I may be a woman of color in the classroom, and some students may identify with that, but it wouldn't really be productive if I continue perpetuating that kind of, wall between the student experience and the professor of color, right? So I think that there are dynamics that need to happen in order for, inclusion to actually be seen and give us a result that is tangible. So yeah, that's my view of vulnerability and how it relates.
And that happened, right? When we all had to teach from home, for those of
Oh
us
yeah.
who taught from home. So my 2-year-old just walking past the camera was me being more vulnerable than I would have ever dreamed of being in that space. Buttoned up, super professional. I mean, my very first creative director was one who told me on my first day, here's all the list of things that you cannot do, and including that was not to wear perfume, because he didn't want, okay. So the very buttoned up, very crisp edges, very, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, very polished face forward. But the moment that I was at home with my 2-year-old and my dog and construction on my house, and just basically putting the camera facing all of the chaos of my life. I know that this is something that's also on your list of questions, Liese, but we're talking about us as educators, right, being vulnerable and how, or, you know, the abilities of us as educators, and inclusion, that everything changed for me from that moment. I have been thinking over the past 18 months about mistakes that I made in my first years of teaching, where I expected students to be what my creative director expected me to be, because my professors in undergrad expected me to be, and so on and so forth down the line. And all of it changed. I don't care if I've got a baby on my lap and a dog who's barking, and I'm still talking and lecturing and listening to students, and they're presenting. You know, I'm doing everything to get that chaos away. But there's going to be people who are sitting on the other side of that camera, watching, listening, learning, and they're learning much more than about grids or the golden ratio or whatever it is that we're talking about that day. There are people who are going to be learning that this was my choice, that I'm offering myself grace, that I have a lot of things going on and I'm still present and I'm still here with you today, and you are important to me, and these other things are happening too, and this is part of my life. There's never a good time to do any of it, but it's happening. and we have to do the best that we can while we're in that space. And if we're leaders of our classrooms, like I've mentioned before, and I can show my students that I'm vulnerable and show them my humanity, maybe they'll appreciate their own. And maybe they'll be able to offer themselves some grace and themselves some space, or people in their lives some space when they need to. And maybe they'll feel more comfortable communicating with me during class or during a project, or, you know, if something happens that maybe I could assist with, right? So if we're educating like future practitioners of designers who are designing for the people, and for users, then acknowledging all facets and all sides and all chaotic bits and parts is kind of imperative to that practice.
You know, Mina, that's really interesting too, because it makes me think about gender, right? And how much women have tried to, you know, have everything, keep everything together, and, you know, just being as professional as you can be. But that's so unrealistic that I think it got to the point where, you know, we just need to say, you know what, this is unattainable, and we need to just be real, you know, and
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with the things that we teach.
Feminism. And
Yeah.
I'll say, and it's not just mothers. There are parents of all across the board who have to decide, okay, you know what, my kid's just not getting a bath tonight. We're eating this. I'm going to reheat this. And also I've got to write this lecture while I'm sitting at the table, and I'm sorry about that. And, you know, there's a lot of heavy lifting that goes on behind the scenes. For our students to be able to see some of that captured might just be a gift to them.
I mean, I think, again, you know, I want to keep the acknowledgement that I carry a lot of privilege sort of both enables me, but also kept me from kind of wanting to be vulnerable, right? And wanting to sort of reveal vulnerabilities. And it wasn't until my second round of grad school applications, you know, when I had gotten into nowhere the year before, that I was like, okay, what is my life really about? Like, what am I really thinking about? And you know, as someone with a chronic pain condition and a chronic collagen deficiency, right? I had grown up sort of, this is the thing that's part of me, and this is the thing that I have, and I don't really need to talk about it. And that is part of, I think, being certainly a man in the society, right? But there's also probably, you know, stuff I need to unpack with my therapist, and I pay someone to do that, so I don't need to do that here, right? But the point is that it was when I was like, okay, I need to talk about this, that somebody said, that's a compelling story and we want to learn more about that. And it's actually not just compelling because, you know, it's a story, but it's compelling because it's going to help other people understand and talk about their experiences. And so destigmatization is sort of what I try to bring to the classroom from day one until the end of the term. And I think a lot of that can come out in grading as well. As somebody, and you know, I don't know if all of you have the same experience, but somebody who comes up through corporate America and branding and advertising and marketing, you know, when I would see papers with incorrect margins, or when I would read papers with, you know, split infinitives, at first when I started teaching, it was like, oh, I can tell these students how to do it. They need to be taught, right? And now I sort of have come to the realization that none of that matters. As long as it's couched in, listen, the world outside this classroom might care, so you should know, but in here, I'm not going to block you from getting to your goal of that A or whatever because of it. And so I think that there's a balance, right? And you know, when I was a grad student at UC San Diego, I taught in a one program where it was a writing program, and my superiors were very proud of the fact that the program was called a GPA killer. And to me, I was like, I don't want to be the GPA killer. Like, I have no interest in blocking anyone because they decide that, you know, they don't want to write a 5-paragraph essay, or they do want to write a 5-paragraph essay. Whatever it is, I'm teaching them, and hopefully they take it with them, or hopefully they don't. And so, you know, I guess what I'm ranting about is that it's it's taken me a lot of work to chill. And I think that actually part of that has to do with being a designer versus an artist. And my colleague, I have a collaborator who we collaborate on almost every art piece installation we do, and we're about to launch a piece. And I've been spending a lot of time on like the interface between the viewer of the piece and the piece itself, right? And like maybe not as much time on what the piece actually does. And you know, we sort of acknowledge that that's the poison of being a designer and an artist. It's like, which part of it really do we need to focus on? And I think that that's also what keeps a lot of designers from being artists, and keeps a lot of designers from willing to push themselves out of what, you know, they've been taught in the years leading up. It's not the right, the 1-inch margins, the grid, the what have you. Yeah, so chill out, designers. It's gonna be okay.
I would just like to add that like vulnerability comes with a double-edged sword. I think especially in academia, it's one thing that is going to take time, but it is one that needs to be, I think, addressed sooner than later. I don't know about you all, but we all, I mean, at least for my education, you know, I have had to teach history of graphic design several times in different places, and when the textbook is always Philip Meggs, and that's the only lens you get to see design history through, it makes it really hard to change the rules. And so, you know, it's going to start curriculum based. It's going to have to start administrative based, and it's having to have proof points that, like, I don't know, metrics and GPAs might not matter as much as quality of work and the ability to articulate your thought process. And so those are harder things to, you know, prove because there's no numbers involved with it, you know, and it's hard to see, and it takes time for people to have success stories. So that's one of the things I've been really kind of having a hard time like working into the classroom, is this idea that we empathy is not just a buzzword, but it is a way that we all had to experience life in the last 2 years. So then how do you make it practice into the profession when everything that we're taught is about like winning or losing? You know, I think like design, at least for me in the 90s, was about like, did you win that contest? Did you win that grant? Did you get that job? Did your design get chosen? And I think it creates a little bit of a hard place to show empathy and vulnerability when there's only one space at the podium. And hopefully profession and academia all gets to that place where there's multiple solutions, and that human design and empathetic design, all of those things are valid, and will make our jobs a lot easier once I think that becomes embraced more, not just within our classrooms, but within our departments and through our institutions.
I think that, vulnerability is also, complex in the sense that knowing what we represent in the classroom and the people that we have around us in the classroom, considering that there are many students from underrepresented groups who have been vulnerable for the, during their whole lives, that they have to be, fighting against the system that has been, oppressive throughout their lives, and that puts them in a constant state of, vulnerability and disadvantage. So I think that being also careful in the way we manifest our own vulnerability is important, knowing that, every person owns their story and nobody should really, try to imply what empathy or vulnerability may look for them. So I think that we just need, especially we're working with the students who are coming from all paths of life, right? Where we have no idea what they have gone through, like their lived experiences or anything similar, situations of immigration or, rape or, all kinds of things that would really shatter how we understand vulnerability from from our own perspective. So I think that doing an exercise in the classroom and gauging what vulnerability means for everybody and knowing how to handle that, in benefit of a balanced and harmonious relation in the classroom, everybody should feel safe in vulnerability. And I think that, it's not as simple as we think.
Absolutely, right. It's about making space for people to be humans together, but not dictating what that looks like, right? Or how much you have to share, or how much of yourself that you have to kind of put out there in the classroom space. Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Gabby. So something that I would really love to get to that's on the list here are what are some things that you all do? Are there things that you've tried in the classroom? Are there best practices that you might know of? Or even if you don't have those best practices, what are things that you've seen? What are things that you've done within the classroom to kind of help with some of these things, right? And again, we're talking about inclusivity and accessibility in sort of a very broad way. So it encompasses all of these kinds of topics that we've been talking about. But what are some of the things that you all have done that you would be willing to share with other educators out there to kind of start to create this sort of space? And I'll shut up now.
I love this question because I'm a list maker, and if I'm like watching something like this at a virtual summit like this, then I'm like, okay, now's when I get my pen and my pad out and I'm starting to write. First off, I think everything has to do with your comfort level too, right? So this works for me, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody else. So the things that I do are like starting off the very first day, probably actually before they even get into my classroom, baked into my syllabus are things like my pronouns next to my name, making classroom and project expectations super clear, just something as simple as like a grade scale and what I'm looking for all of the projects and that kind of stuff, including a land acknowledgement in my syllabus, making sure to acknowledge that here in South Carolina, that's very important to me personally. Offering up rental information for laptops or for technology, right? Just offering it in the syllabus. Don't even ask me. You don't have to ask me. I can happily answer your question because it's in my syllabus, but you don't have to broach that topic with me. It's not something we haven't already covered in the syllabus. Happy to discuss it. Posting lab hours that, you know, across the university, clearly, so that they can just know if they don't have access to a computer, if they're sharing it with their sibling who is taking classes virtually. Being flexible with freeware if possible. Like if your particular learning outcomes aren't Adobe specific, right? Again, this is up to the comfort level of your class, but being flexible with freeware. If there's another software that a student can use and they can get to the end goal, then that could make for a really interesting conversation in class, right? Finding out on the same subject if your local library offers free Adobe and LinkedIn Learning subscriptions to students, because many do. But, you know, also making sure in your project handouts just to include tutorial links. I give my handouts virtually, so all of my links are clickable. So students can just go to those links if they don't quite know what the pen tool is or something like that, and they can just learn right there. So again, they're not feeling like they're trying to broach some topic that's maybe expected for them to know or something like that. This is just something that's on the table. We can talk about it already. And then I'll just end with this one for now, that some students don't identify with the names that are in the LMS systems like Blackboard or Canvas or anything like that. So, you know, just asking students on the very first day, you know, what name do you want to go by, and sticking to that, not necessarily going specifically by what the university gives you on the roster or what the LMS says on the roster for your class. They can nip those issues in the bud on the first day. And I'll tell you from firsthand experience, that makes a big difference in your classroom. Students will remember things like that. So I will pause there.
For stuff like that, Mina, which is so important, I really like to use a Google form. I'm reticent to use Google, right? I try not to whenever I can, but sometimes the convenience is way too much. But I use a Google form so that it drops everything into a spreadsheet for me, which is really nice. And especially teaching, I found there to be a lot of silver lining, like small silver linings when I was teaching via Zoom all year. One of which was that I could quickly look at the spreadsheet and reference people's preferred names and pronouns instead of memorizing 75 of them. But, you know, I like to ask like, hey, my name is, and I prefer that you call me, and this is what I like to do outside of, and I took this class because of it. It also gets you on day one. Like I send this out, I either have them do it for 15 minutes at the beginning of day one, or I have it also kind of doesn't require the going around in a circle and like sharing what we brought to the picnic kind of thing. But also I really like to use like back channel and collaborative notes documents. So again, Zoom's chat feature was awesome this past year, and I'm going to miss it this coming year for those classes that I have to teach in person, that I get to teach in person, because my students are hilarious, and they would never say the things they do out loud that they said in the Zoom. And so I've been thinking, I don't know if any of you have any recommendations on like, what can I use when I'm in the classroom to let them have a back channel that I can be a part of. They have a Discord, and at one point they were like, Gabi, join our Discord. I was like, no, no, like I'm friendly, but I'm not your friend. But then also I think I use like an Etherpad. Again, I'm reticent to use Google Docs, but I think collaborative note-taking is really helpful because individuals who have a hard time paying attention, individuals who's you know, have a hard time understanding when I talk really quickly, individuals who have to, you know, use the facilities or go take care of a kid or go take care of a parent. That's been really helpful. Captioning, obviously, I like lobbied my school. We didn't have built-in Zoom captioning when I first started, and I like emailed the chair and then the dean and then the AVP of whatever, and finally we got it. And even then, you know, other faculty members are not turning it on because it's not on by default because it costs the school money to use every minute. So those are, I think, really like baseline things. And then just because I'll monopolize, because I've got the microphone. I know, Lisa, you had mentioned the stuff that I talked about at the SEGD conference about the crit, right? The crit, I think, is super valuable as a teaching tool in design. It's also can be highly problematic. And I think that there are a number of things that we can do when we, you know, when we run our crits. And I'll just run them through them really quickly, right? I think that making printing free, which I don't know how to make that happen here yet, but I know that especially, you know, again, my focus is on disability. So disabled people make pennies on the dollar. You know, their minimum wage doesn't exist. And so really, you know, I think that cost is an access thing from really any access or accessibility or inclusivity. And so thinking about like not making your students print things is really helpful, or finding a budget to help them print. I also think encouraging a room environment where standing is not privileged. So putting desks, you know, kind of in front of the wall, not making everyone stand up can be really helpful. It also helps people not only with mobility impairments, but also like, I need to change how I'm sitting very often, or else I'll feel it for the next week. And so that can be really helpful. Non-oral presentation methods. So again, like back channel documents, silent crits. This is mitigating, you know, the fact that a lot of people are just, you know, whether it be a neurodiversity or simply somebody who really is terrified, or they've been scarred by another instructor who, you know, shamed them publicly and they really would rather not. And then I think, you know, giving students time and space. So like a 4-hour time block with 16 students or however it's arranged at your institution, rather than doing 15 people watching one person for 4 hours, have 3 people watch one person for an hour and then switch out the groups. And I tell my students, like, granted this was on Zoom and we'll see how it works out this year in the studio, but like, come if you'd like to, but you don't have to. Work in the background quietly, pick up, you know, from other people, but really it's about those core 4 people. And that also helps with the space mitigation for standing and sitting. You can move tables more easily when you have a smaller group. And then the last thing, I learned this from an instructor of mine at MassArt, who was like so instrumental in how I teach today, but she would always say, do you have what you need to keep going? And it's not something that immediately comes to mind when I'm giving a crit. And so hearing that was like, oh, a reminder of why we're doing it, right? And not saying this was bad, figure it out. Or I don't know, which a lot of people will say. I think that saying, do you have what you need? And asking the students to be honest and saying, you can say no and we'll keep working, or you can come to my office hours or whatever. But that final check-in can be so valuable for students that a lot of students will kind of be like, oh, yeah, I think I do. And then I feel better. And even if they're lying to me, like that's at that point on them. But, you know, yeah, do you have what you need to keep going? So.
I'm currently, well, the reason why I'm in the park right now is I'm doing a restorative justice workshop. And I think a lot of the practices that I've been learning over the last, you know, half decade in regards to restorative justice are things that we could move into the classroom that I think get to that point of non-hierarchical structures of a class and like the flattening of a class structure. And so I think Zoom in one of those, you know, happenstance ways forced us to not have a podium at the front. You know, whoever took over the mic was the person that was leading the class at that moment. And I think there was a lot of things that we could kind of inherit and bring towards like face-to-face, if it's safe to do so in the fall. One of the other things I thought was super helpful that I feel like was something that I had to move, sorry.
So we cut off right when you said something that was like really like helpful for you, and then we lost you.
Oh shoot, I don't even know. Yeah, I was just saying like Zoom recordings, the flattening of Zoom, like the Zoom like format. I think all those things are helpful. Not having to repeat something 20 times over and over and over again, but just referring to a video. And not just making it a YouTube video, but a video that speaks directly to what exactly you're working on, and having your face and voice so it's relatable. All those things I think have made like learning in a very difficult time easier, you know? So how do we kind of inherit those things into the studio environment this fall? That was, I think I ended on that. Sorry. I was chopping in and out.
Yeah, for me, I, I I try to keep the syllabi with some degree of openness so that, you know, things can be, you know, restructured or rethought when needed. Especially here in Florida, you know, one of the things that happen very often are hurricanes. So we need to, you know, many times rethink about, you know, what happens and people going to see their families and, you know, in the worst scenarios, people suffering, you know, from flooding and, you know, so it's really a complicated, you know, environment. But in general, I think that it's really important to know that, you know, people have different cognitive needs, even if, you know, someone doesn't have an accommodation or anything like that. You know, I work better reading than listening, for example, right? So I try to make sure that, as it was mentioned before, that we have collective notes, that everybody can share a file and everybody's putting in their notes. It's really interesting to see how people understand the same thing, and the kinds of you know, things that different people think are the most important. So that is an approach that I really like, that I've seen working well. I think that I'm going to be using much more Zoom for office hours, or, you know, just having chats with my students so that they don't have to rely on the physical space. I think that's important, and something that actually worked out coming from the pandemic, you know, teaching online. I like to speak in Spanish whenever is appropriate, when students initiate a conversation and they evidently feel better working in or speaking in Spanish. I am 100%, you know, willing to do that as well. So I think it's the little things that usually make a huge difference. The way that you treat people, the way that you talk to people. I mean, it may not be like a list of things that, you know, if anyone could just put in the syllabus, but I think it's just the daily interactions that actually make the most difference. And trying to, you know, at least annotate things that are particular to each student, so that we can remember, you know, simple things about their personality or their work that may be important to for us to remember. So yeah, those are some of the things that I try to do.
Gabi, it's so important that you mentioned that, you know, don't rely on accommodations letters. There's empirical research, right, that points to the fact that it's stigmatized, and students don't want to go to the accommodations office. They feel like A, they'll be told no because it's not bad enough. B, they're nervous that, you know, it will reflect poorly on their grade because the instructor will see it, right? And C, they worry how it look. What pressure cooker exists that, you know, like undergraduate college, and you know, peer pressure and that sort of thing. And I think you make such a good, like, I just want to like highlight that one and be like, don't tell a student, well, if you want that, bring me an accommodation letter. And also, let's think about the individuals working in the accommodations office who are way understaffed, way under-resourced, and way overburdened. And so, you know, I get these PDFs from that office where the title of the PDF is like ASDFGH, right? Because somebody was just like, I need to get this out, or whatever. And I sent it back and I was like, hey, I just want to make sure that you're the ones that sent this. And they're like, we don't know how that happened. Yeah, that one's fine. These people are doing wonderful work, and they're just working. They don't have, you know, what they need to get it done. And so, like, let's let them focus on other things that need to be happening on this campus, like captioning universally, right, and so forth and so on. So thank you, Gabi, for pointing that one out.
fabulous suggestions. I think, to Mina's point, people watching this will be able to make a really lovely list of things to try. And again, still being mindful of time, because especially I think Dave needs to go fairly soon. I just want to kind of throw out anything else any of you would like to add. One of my final questions was, what do we do sort of when things midstream seem like they're not going well? What can we add? What can we try? But also another question I threw on there was, what about us? Right? As faculty, how are we, how are we experiencing feeling included, or issues of accessibility? So any final thoughts from any of the panelists? You can answer one of those things, or just anything else that you want to share before we wrap up.
Well, I think maybe I'll just answer both with one. So this is like, I'm coming into my 12th year of teaching, I think, including my adjunct time. And I think that if something's not working for the class, it's not working for me. And if I'm feeling out of place, then somebody else is too. So that, what I have done before, I'm not going to go through my horror stories. I have them, and we all do, but I think what I've learned from those moments is that it's best to pause, assess, acknowledge, learn, and then lead the class or the team from there. So not ignoring. It's like, personally, if we ignore something that's going on wrong in our lives, things are not going to get better. Similar to the classroom, but acknowledging it, having a conversation if that's warranted, if that's the comfortable thing to do, if that's the right thing to do. Sometimes that's not the right thing to do, just to highlight that. But just to lead from that moment and acknowledge that moment and allow that moment to be acknowledged to you if you weren't aware of it, being open to receive that information. I think that those kind of decisive maneuvers, those very decisive moves, to maybe recap what might be going wrong, or might be headed in a wrong direction, whether that's throughout a semester, the arc of a semester, or throughout a crit, just like in, 15 minutes, right? Just acknowledging it, recapping it if it's necessary, and then leading in the direction that the group needs to go based on the group will build trust too. So you're doing yourself a solid, but you're doing the group a solid too. I just think ignoring things that are going wrong in ourselves or in our team, our class is our team. I'm referring to the class as a team. That never works out. No.
In regards professors and inclusivity, what about us? I think that it's a team effort in that it requires not only faculty, but also staff and administrators to, create a space that is really inclusive and really equitable and accessible for everybody. I think that faculty also need to feel included in order to do a good job in the classroom. I think that administrators, for example, might find helpful to focus on the social aspect of being a professor in a university. We all like to have friends, we all like to go out, we all like to, eating out or having, some sort of social time during the week. So I think that one, at least in my experience as an assistant professor, I feel that there are never enough opportunities for faculty of all levels to just get together and be social. And I think that that's what brings our humanity out. And, you know, I think that storytelling is one of those things that are the most powerful when it comes to, you know, sharing and building community. So, you know, having those opportunities, I think, are very, very important for as part of the whole inclusion and access effort.
It's a tough one. You know, again, I've only been in this job for a year. Dave mentioned a few times that he never really felt like he wanted to be in academia, but it just sort of happened that way. And that's exactly how it happened for me. In retrospect, it was, the path was sort of set from very early on, but I was like, no. Anyway, all of that is to say, I think imposter syndrome is at the root of a lot of why faculty act the way they do. And I think that we need to be really forgiving of ourselves because of how hard we are asked to work and because of how hard we then work. And we have many masters to whom we must, I suppose using that terminology is probably not the best. We have many individuals to whom we report, right? We have administration, we have senior colleagues, we have external committees, you know, and then we have students, and you know, the idea that students are customers, I really hate that idea. I think students are best framed as collaborators. That said, you know, we do need to answer to students. They need things from us, and we owe them things. And so I think at times it's very easy for us to, you know, at least as a junior faculty member, you have to sort of make up where the priorities lie. And Dave mentioned a lot about, you know, breaking down hierarchies, and sometimes those hierarchies are just inherent. And so I try really hard to force myself to prioritize for the way I think I should. And I'm trying to be very gentle here, and not in the ways that the system has perhaps prescribed it for me. Again, it's easy for me to do that, right? Like, I will probably have opportunities to skirt through ways that a lot of y'all and a lot of my colleagues won't. And so it's hard for me to say, what about us? Because my own experience, you know, is going to be unique just like everyone else's. And so I guess I'm saying, like, really digging down and determining what privilege you embody as a faculty member, and deciding and being real with yourself about it is something that I think we all should be doing. And but being fair to yourself too. Am I making sense? Like, I'm trying to say, like, it's easy for me to sit here and be like, you know, whatever, you're getting paid to do the work, like, be nice to your students, because it's so much more complex than that. But, you know, these students are trying hard, and they're, you were there once, and I think, I don't know if you're going to edit this at all, Lisa, but like, this rambling is getting to the point where I really just want to say, just because you as a faculty, as a student, were perhaps treated in a certain way, doesn't mean you need to reify the structures to which you were victim. That's what I think. I'll leave it at that.
And not to stretch this out too much longer, because again, want to be respectful of everyone's time, but this is something Mina and I talked about, right? As faculty, what baggage are we bringing with us, right? From the institutions where we learned, what baggage are we bringing with us in regards to what we think a student is, what a student should do, what a designer is, what a designer should do, you know, how are we perpetuating how we were taught, just because that's how we were taught, right? Versus really thinking about how we would like to teach, right? And the things that we want to kind of create in the world. And I think that those are often the tensions that at least I see, but I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about that too.
Yeah.
You can tell by my eye rolling and my head throwing back that, yeah, yes, please. You just basically edit out what I just rambled about. That was exactly what I was trying to say.
No, we needed to hear what you had to say, Gabi, because I mean, that's just, listen, so I mentioned previously about, I think back to the mistakes that I made my first few years of teaching, that I just wasn't aware that I was doing the same thing. And I never liked it when I saw it the first time. But I remember hearing one of my students, so my name is Mina Khalil, and one of my students, Tiora Hackley, shout out, Atlanta, she called me Khaleesi, and I said, oh, ha, yeah, I love Game of Thrones, it's great. And she was like, no, because you put blood all over our crit. And what she was talking about was my red Sharpie marker. And they would tile up black and white, because we could laser print for free, some in progress crit posters, right? And I would go through and I would edit, I would write, I would do this thing. And I wasn't even thinking that aggressive Sharpie marker was making a mark on them. And they all had the conversation going. But then she was sort of, it was kind of lighthearted, but she was like, oh, you're making it bleed. And I immediately switched to highlighter. I immediately switched to yellow or pink highlighter. That was my go-to, because I realized, like, I still needed to make the corrections. I still needed to do my job. I owed them my wisdom, but I didn't have to be so aggressive about it. And I didn't even realize that what I had done was something that had been earmarked prior, something that had been done just in that way, in my experience. So it's changing it, right? We have to decide what we want to bring to the profession. Did we aspire to be like that thing? Or do we aspire to embrace or change, be more fluid, adjust, respond? And that's your personal decision.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over. I love the idea of I owe them my wisdom, which can sound on the surface very self-aggrandizing, right? But at the same time, it's exactly the truth. We've spent many years preparing for this. They're here for that reason, but we owe it to them. And I think it acknowledges both our expertise, and again, that's like get past the imposter syndrome by acknowledging we have that wisdom, right, but recognize that we are in debt to them. We owe that to them. I really love that thinking.
And to be honest, I do not believe that my wisdom is perfection. I believe I've learned some things that, I would like to share. That's it.
And if it's a continuum, right? Maybe they're here, maybe you're here, but you're not all the way at the end, right? That it keeps going, it keeps growing, right? Yeah. All right.
Dave,
I think we did. I'm so bummed, but I'm so glad he was able to join us for as long as he could. So yeah, I don't know if there's any other final thoughts. I think we heard from everyone with my question about final thoughts, but then we had a little conversation there. So if there's anything else you wanted to add, but otherwise we can probably wrap up this really beautiful conversation.
Thank you, Liese. Thank you for hosting this and for asking such great questions. And it was really wonderful to meet you, Gabi, and other Gaby Hernandez. It's good to see you again. I miss you very much. And I'm so excited for you at U of Arc.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's always awesome to see you all. Hopefully when conferences come back to face to face, we can hug each other.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. It was a really lovely conversation. As always, I learn so much, just like I do in the classroom. That's why I love learning with working with students. I learn so much every day. But it was just really fantastic to hear from all of you, and from Dave, who joined us in the middle of like a workshop in the middle of a park, which I love, and brought some really beautiful thoughts and ideas with him as well. So thank you, everyone. As I said, this will be published as part of the ShiftED materials, so you can check it out there if you want to listen to all of this again. I know I do. But otherwise, I hope you all have a really beautiful rest of your day. And hopefully I will see all of you very soon. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Gabby Shawson. Thanks, Gaby Hernandez. Thanks, Liese.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Meena.